Welcome back to this podcast series with Fiona Leteney, senior analyst at Fosway Group. She has just published the 9 Grid covering learning systems, and we have been having a series of conversations with Fiona about some of her observations. Fiona, welcome back.
Thank you so much.
In the first conversation, you mentioned 3 things that we wanted to talk about. You mentioned the economic headwinds that are sort of changing buying patterns. You mentioned AI, and we can't get away from a conversation in learning these days if we don't talk about the third thing, which is skills. Skills has been front and center for a while, seems increasingly so, and it definitely took center stage in some ways in the 9 Grid. I am interested, as skills continues to gain prominence, what were some of the things you observed in the research this year?
So actually the big surprise for us this time, and a really positive surprise, was when we published the Digital Learning Reality Survey. And for the first time ever, there was something that knocked compliance and regulatory training off the top spot when we've asked the question, what's your priority for the coming year? And that piece that knocked compliance off the top spot was upskilling and reskilling. And so I think there was a collective remote leaping up and down in Fosway for that to actually happen. Not that compliance is any less important. It's just, I think, the realization for L&D particularly, that upskilling and reskilling was a real priority. But I think the other thing to kind of caveat all this with is that it might be a priority, but I'm not sure it's the case that we've got the answers to how we tackle this and, how we grasp it and put our arms around it. I think that's still an ongoing conversation and a lot of head scratching still as well.
What do you think drove the change? Is it just, people realize this is important and it can yield competitive advantage? Or is it that folks are terrified of the AI revolution and they have no idea what to do with the humans that work for their organizations?
There has been the skills story for a long time. And we're probably, third or fourth iteration of this. Back in the day, it was competitive competency frameworks. That's what I'm trying to say. The competency frameworks we've had over the years, and as soon as we've ended up with the a framework published, it's out of date. And so I think it was the AI that certainly made Fosway a little bit more positive about this time round, this could work. And so I think there's that side of it, but it also, it seems to make a lot more sense if we talk about skills being the currency, that it is the transferable piece for people moving from one job to another. And it really does make sense. And there is that hope that this will work this time. It's just, how do we define it? I think one of the things that we're seeing is that skills, it's the granularity of the skills that everybody's grappling with. Some are just keeping them large, and there could be tens of skills that they will be tackling from the top down, if you like, in an organization. And then there are others where it gets really granular and you're talking about tens of thousands of skills. And really it's into the minutiae and the detail, really at the business end, I would say. So there's a lot going on, but a lot of issues still to solve, I suppose.
It's interesting. I like the example, and it sort of makes sense now. We've not only got the pressure from an economic headwinds perspective, as we talked about in one of the last episode, and the opportunity from an AI-based personalization perspective, but as you start to bring all of this together with skills as the currency, the opportunity to sort of redeploy people and get them reskilled in the right way for open roles is really there. Going back in time, I remember, 15 years ago, in the independent days of success factors under Lars Dalgaard's leadership as it was sort of emerging as that talent cloud. Um, there was a lot of focus on that story, but you know, systems didn't really talk to one another very easily. And so I'm interested. You know, I remember in those points in time, most HR modules spoke to one another through middleware, whether it was MuleSoft or Dell Boomi or some other component, and you often had just the transactional engine speaking, none of the underlying data like you would have around an employee in terms of skills, et cetera. Uh, how are you seeing this kind of interoperability and data exchange problem being tackled? Because I imagine to solve for the promise that you talked about, that's a really big part of the puzzle.
Oh, this is huge, and I think I know going back, I think probably pandemic times, talking to people in quite large organisations where everything was standalone, and even the HR system didn't talk to the learning system, and stuff was being added manually, and all that kind of thing. And so, one of the things that a few years ago we kind of invented a new word, which was kind of ecosystemness, and the ability for a vendor to fit into an ecosystem. And I think it has a combination of reasons for doing that. And one is it being much easier for the learner. So the learner's experience within the system is, if it's a smooth transition from one system to the other that they don't even notice, then that actually is the best way to be. But there is a huge requirement now that if you haven't got the data traveling around from into every system, you're not going to be able to keep up to date the skills of those individuals. And it is so important. We put and it's sometimes, we feel as though the same, not necessarily exactly the same paragraph, but within the 9-grid report, we will continue a theme. And I think the interoperability and the integration of systems within an ecosystem is just one of the most important things. And actually, we have corporate projects that we work with corporate organizations, and sometimes that they will come to us and say, right, we might need to add a system into this, an LXP or whatever. And we sometimes go back to them and say, look, you need to re-implement the system you've got, because the connections, the ecosystem is just, they were having to, once they found and I'm serious about this, once they'd found the course that they wanted, they had to log in 3 times for 3 different systems before they got to it. And that is just not a good learning experience. But again, passing all the data along the line is, I just cannot emphasize how important that is for us to move forward properly.
So you sort of jump on both the learner experience and what does this mean from a usability perspective, and then that also calls into question the awareness for buyers. Like, are folks aware of what to look for when they're making these decisions in terms of ecosystemness, like the readiness to adapt in these scenarios?
Actually, this was something that dawned on David Wilson and myself when we were writing the report for the large enterprise learning, that experience in the industry and knowing why a system was bought originally was so important to because quite often if the person that implemented the system originally left or moved on or whatever, and somebody else came in, all they would see would be the problems. And when they attempted to go through an RFP and whatever, and then they brought in a new system, only at that point would they find that actually some things were missing that the other system did in the background that they didn't know. They were configured a particular way and that kind of thing. So I think the experience both of the buyer is actually is actually quite crucial, and the maturity of the buyer is quite crucial. So they understand their organization, and that gets, as the organizations get bigger and bigger and more complex and more sophisticated, that's more and more difficult to achieve. And so there's that side of it, but there's also that experience within some of the vendors, and knowing that we maybe call them maybe new kids on the block that were originally brought in when we used to call them the next gen learning environments, coming in, that the LXP story was built on, and but then realizing that it's not mid-market they can deal with. And it goes back to something I think I was talking about in the first podcast, was that the size of the organization buying a learning management system for the first time is gradually dropping, and when it was at the level where it was still in the thousands, maybe 3,000 up to 10,000, then a lot of the new next gen learning environments came in at that point and were providing maybe a better experience than some of the massive learning systems that there were. When you start to step up into that large enterprise area, then there are new things to take into account, and it's important then that the experience of the vendor is taken into consideration. And I think some of the those new vendors taking on experienced, maybe from other organizations, experienced, Degreed taking you on from SAP, the experience that you had with SAP will benefit Degreed, and it's that kind of thing that's absolutely essential, that experience, both of the vendor but on the buyer side as well, so that these mistakes aren't being made.
You talk about this pressure in navigating that change, understanding what a system was in place to do and what it wasn't. In the first conversation we had, we talked about that pressure to consolidate potentially from a financial perspective. Do you see this at all playing into potentially the creation of risk, right? Are people accelerating into consolidation decision potentially without thinking about interoperability at these points? Because I could imagine those two forces are in conflict.
Yeah, this consolidation, there's a lot of it going on, and at quite a number of different levels. It isn't just large enterprise, although that's happening a lot there. Where it's happening at the large enterprise level, the consolidation is often, in a way, out of L&D's hands, and that there is a risk in there as well. And the reason it's out of L&D's hands is because there is either a requirement for the tech stack to be simplified, or there is a requirement for costs to be cut. And therefore, it's the CFO and the CTO that will say, okay, we will use the learning module of the HCM system. And they are, at this moment in time, good enough. That is what we're saying, as well as Fosway, is that a lot of these larger systems, their learning modules are good enough. And as I say, L&D don't necessarily get a say in the matter. They don't get a vote. It just is imposed on them. But then there is the detail, what is it that actually is missing from the learning modules of the HCMs? And that's when there is the need then to go and have a look and see some maybe point solutions of specialists going in at that point. So yeah, there is risk there, and sometimes from what we're hearing, then it is definitely a risk that the CFOs and the CTOs are willing to take, but the L&D departments will have to then go in and work out what it is where the gaps are, and where they either. Yeah. And they have then the justification to go back to the CFO and say, we need something else.
It's interesting because I think this, what is the readiness to integrate skills data across this ecosystem to drive reskilling? And then what is the good enough solution can often be sort of in stark contrast. And so I think, that'll be fascinating to watch play out. How does the desire to reskill, which is often a CEO agenda item, sort of run into the CFO imperative to drop cost? And so I'll be looking forward to next year's 9 grid and what you've seen in that journey. Fiona, one last question from my side. We're at the end of our series, and upskilling is near and dear to my heart. I think we're going to look out in the future and we are going to see people, not people, replaced with agentic AI in all use cases. And that means we're going to need to change the people, change their skill sets, get them ready. What is one piece of advice that you would leave leaders with as they approach an upskilling and reskilling journey?
I think the most important thing is to partner with your vendor. I think that we saw on all the research, it's the partnerships that where the value is, so that you can be part of the conversation. You can as a buyer, you can influence the roadmap and you can influence the direction of travel, because and also give the reality checks to the vendors, so that we can often think very blue sky thinking, and this is how it could be, but the devil's always in the detail, and every organization is different, and it's finding those vendors that you can actually have that conversation with. But it's going to be really important to work together, to be able to work the way through that. I can't see any other way of doing it. Is just talking and partnering between the vendor and the buyer.
Every company is unique. Every
Exactly.
reskilling journey is unique, and
Exactly.
therefore you need to partner with your vendor. I love it. Fiona, thank you so much for this conversation and the past conversations. As I said, am already looking forward to next year's 9 grid and grateful for all the work and research you do across the community.
Thank you so much, Max. It's been a pleasure also. Thank you.